You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Professor Scot Danforth of Chapman University to discuss his new book, Independent Man, Ed Roberts and the Fight for Disability Rights. We chat about Ed's life, the origins of the disability movement, and creating access for all. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of Subway Crayonistas and City Smarties, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you want to just give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with zero outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it and how to get it into your podcatcher. We've also recently put up some bonus material and have weekly free posts from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, it's still winter, so get your heavyweight bus or bike scarves. You definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, and for the anti-bus activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. Just a quick note to interject, because I didn't want to record the whole thing over again, but we have actually sold out of the bus-only knit scarves, but they'll be back in stock. I've made another order, and they'll be back soon, so just hang in there. We had some big orders come in, and we appreciate that, but then we also figured out that we ran out, so check back in with us in a couple weeks, or you can pre-order. Send me a note, and we'll send one to you right away as soon as we get them back in stock. There are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from the bookshop site, either the books from the authors we interview, or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the now 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 100,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes for that one as well. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's called Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements. But for now, just enjoy the show. Well, Scot Danforth, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a professor of disability studies at Chapman University, which is in Orange, California, Southern California. I specialize in studying the disability rights movement.
Nice. And what got you into thinking about these issues? Like, what was the first introduction to the issues that you're studying?
I'm a faculty member in education. I have been working for a long time on what we call inclusive education, which is how can you not segregate kids with disabilities into separate classes or schools? How can they be integrated and learn with their non-disabled peers? And I did that for a long time. And then I realized that many of the people around me who were working on these same issues knew nothing about where our access laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, they knew very little about disability rights. And I started thinking, where did all this stuff come from? So initially, I wanted to find out where it started. It sent me to the University of California, Berkeley, and the protests in the late 60s. To start to dig up how did disability rights become a thing in the United States.
And so you wrote this book, An Independent Man, Ed Roberts and the Fight for Disability Rights, which is, really an amazing work. I'm impressed by the breadth of it and the amount of information that you give us. What got you thinking Ed Roberts would be a good topic to discuss?
So I stumbled upon this group of students. These were students who were living with various kinds of paralysis. And it was 1968, 1969 on the Cal campus. And the group was called the Rolling Quads. And they were led by Ed Roberts. And so I studied them. They had a big protest where they fought the California Department of Rehabilitation came up with very different ideas. Their notion wasn't that disability was about being sick and needing better health care, although that's always useful. It was a political problem. And that was an astounding idea. But I realized in doing that work that Ed Roberts, there was no biography of the leader. How will people know about disability rights if we can't know about the leaders? So I said, well, I better learn how to write a biography and spend 8 years. Thank you for the compliment on the book. Spend 8 years studying Ed and the people around him too. Certainly wasn't a solitary venture. He was part of a team.
Well, it's interesting, here in the Bay Area, obviously, I'm in San Francisco and I worked in Oakland for a number of years and I take BART a lot. And so, when the Ed Roberts campus came to be a part of the Ashby BART station, that was a big deal. And then, you have to start thinking like, well, where did this name Ed Roberts come from? And the book kind of lays it all out. But I'm also wondering about Ed himself and, where he came from and what you learned about where he came from and what he went through.
Yeah, he was a kid from your side of the bay, from Burlingame, just south of the airport. Then it was a very working class area. His dad was a railroad union man. He had three brothers, but as a teenager, this is in the mid 50s, he came down with polio. And he spent 18 months in the hospital with all kinds of therapies and treatments and everything that they could do to sort of put him on his feet, and it had no effect whatsoever. He was in an iron lung. An iron lung is a giant sort of a steel can, an enormous box that puts pressure on the body so that it pushes your lungs to breathe. And, he came home and they set up an iron lung in the living room. And he was really faced with the problem to him wasn't just, my body doesn't work the way I want it to. He was paralyzed from the neck down. The problem was, how was he going to have any life at all? No one in the late 1950s thought that someone with that kind of disability could go get an education, could get a job, could travel in the community or go to a restaurant. It was just his fate was to be a tragedy, to be a figure that to stay in a back room and stay out of sight. And he really refused. He and his mother, too, his mother, Zona, refused to let that happen. And as they forged a path for him, as he broke down doors and pushed his way into the local high school, then on to Cal, he was opening doors for others simultaneously. And he was very, very aware of that. He didn't just feel he was doing something for himself. He always knew that he was the first one through and he was trying to bring through the rest of the gang.
How did he get his personality? Because that was one of the things that helped him continue and move forward through this ordeal. It's something that is really impressive about Ed was just his somewhat prickly, but also but also shining personality.
Yeah, it's true. We decided the book cover is just overwhelming purple that just punches you in the face. Pink.
I love it, by the way.
I'm saying
great.
purple is pink. These very bright colors, and that was him. He was fun-loving, arrogant, over the top, full of himself, and yet very caring, very sensitive at the same time. This was a guy who he learned that he was going to have to fight every day for every inch he gained, but he also took relish in it. He really enjoyed it. He even enjoyed losing because he was going to show up the next day and go at it again. And he became part of a crew at Berkeley. Think of Berkeley in the late 60s, protests, the free speech movement, Vietnam, the People's Park protests. I mean, all of that was the background. It was the perfect place for Ed and the people around him. And his partner there was his buddy, John Hessler, another man who was paralyzed and used a wheelchair. And they learned how to be radicals. They learned how to take to the streets, and they learned how to win victories over powerful institutions through civil rights tactics. So that, Ed was always this guy who loved being on the stage. He loved being in the limelight, and he loved having a good fight.
I want to learn a little bit more about polio too at that time period. You talk about in the book where, he was not very far away from Jonas Salk releasing the vaccine. And I'm fascinated by what it was like then in terms of what people knew about the disease and what happened to folks, but also what have we lost since then in terms of knowing what it is and what it did to people.
I don't think we're aware now. I think as our federal government is telling us, oh, vaccines aren't important. In the early 1950s, each summer, the warm weather seemed to be the time, and polio was a virus, and it seemed to be the time when people caught polio. And, for some people, like I'll give an example of the rock star, Neil Young. Neil Young had polio and went away to a hospital for about a week in Canada. And he came back and he learned how to walk again and went on with his life. And that was pretty typical. But for some people, the polio would have stronger effects. And that was an extremely small population. But that population would end up paralyzed and sometimes dead. And it depended upon whether the polio entered into the stem of the brain and began to shut down functioning in the body. So it wasn't that the muscles wouldn't work anymore. The signals from the brain could not get to the muscles. But in the mid-50s, everyone was scared. I mean, mothers were afraid to send their children to the local swimming pool or to the theater because they weren't really sure how you caught it, but everyone knew somebody. Everyone knew someone who had polio. Everyone knew that story. But then the development of the vaccines, there were two different vaccines. Salk developed one. Another man named Sabin developed one a couple years later. The Salk one involved a couple of injections, and that was used widely. The Sabin one was even cheaper. It just involved taking a little sugary lozenge and putting it on your tongue. And that one was spread all around the world. If you want to know how polio was wiped out or almost wiped out across many countries in Africa, for instance, they took the Sabin vaccine because they could send these little sugary lozenges with the vaccine all over the world and not worry about refrigeration. But it was a scary, scary thing. And we are out of touch with that. We're too confident. We assume that once you defeat something like that it's not going to come back, but we have to keep vaccinating children.
Yeah, it's another discussion, but I feel like this is also a really important lesson to learn about what, Ed went through, but also what affected him. I mean, how he got polio was extremely devastating, and having to sleep with the iron lung every single night and not being able to go on trips unless he did this magical,
Right.
breathing technique. The things that he had to do to live a life was something that most people don't have to contend with. I'm interested also in, people don't know what an iron, you mentioned iron lung earlier, but it's like a box, maybe the size of a Volkswagen.
Yeah, it'll fill a room.
It's crazy how trying to find an apartment that you can fit a box in like that.
Well, and that was the trouble when he was admitted at Cal. They had no housing to put that kind of contraption in. He ended up in the campus hospital, basically Cowell Hospital. The university luckily had a hospital on campus with an empty floor. And Ed moved in, and then the next year, John Hessler, this is 1962, 63. And then by the late 60s, they had about a dozen students with physical disabilities filling up this hospital wing right on campus. And that's where they began to talk to each other and to radicalize each other.
I'm also interested early on about, and this is something I think kids go through a lot, but like they try to figure out what they can control. And early on, the thing that he could control above anything else was whether he ate or not. And that was a very important, I feel like, part of the book is figuring out what he can control and not eating and getting really sickly. And then figuring out, well, this isn't the way to go forward. But understanding that if you're that disabled and you don't know what to do and don't have the experience he did later in life, figuring out what you could and couldn't control and then being stubborn enough to say, okay, well, I'm going to do this. I mean, I feel like I've done that a few times in my life where like I grew my hair out of my beard because I could. Nobody's telling me to shave my beard, so I'm just going to do it kind of thing. I kind of empathize with them in that sense in that time in his life.
Yeah, I think it's a lesson for all of us. We all wonder what we control and what we can't and how to let go what we can't control. And for Ed as a teenager, initially, in the hospital, he could control almost nothing. And he realized he could control whether food went into his mouth. And so at one point he was very depressed and he essentially stopped eating. He essentially refused to eat, and he later described it as a suicide attempt. But when he finally did take control in a more positive way, which was decide, yes, I'm going to eat. Yes, this is my body. This is my life. And then he began the very, very slow work of creating what I would call a persona, a character. To give an example, today, if you're a young person with a disability, whatever the disability is, you probably can look out in society and find role models. There are some people that you can look to that, are making it, that are doing well in society. I'm not saying enough of them, but there's some people you can look to and say, look at that. I could be like that. That wasn't true for him. There was no one like that. And he really had to cook up a character, and this took him years, in his mind, that he was this person with this really unusual body, with this really unusual life, but he was going to live that life out in the world and make it as good as he could, the best that he could.
How did his parents impact that?
His mother, Zona, especially, she taught him how to fight. She was not a person who was a fighter. Let me put it that way. She just died a year ago, a little more than a year ago, at 105. A small, rather down to earth, gentle woman. But for instance, there was an example where Ed finished all the high school requirements at Burlingame High School. And the administrators told him and his mother repeatedly that he could not graduate because he had not completed driver's education and physical education. And Zona was just flabbergasted. How could these smart, educated people think that Ed was going to do PE? But
or drive.
She went and fought for him. There's a scene in the book which is very much like a movie scene. This very nervous, in over her head mom with her notes. She's ready for the meeting. She goes to the school board meeting and she has to, stand up and make her case for them to give an exemption and give him the high school diploma. Now, luckily for her, they had already decided to grant that, so she didn't even have to make the request, but she was ready for it. And the minute they told her that Ed was graduating, she just sat down and cried. But she was a powerful figure, not only in learning to fight, but in getting him out of the house. Part of that was she knew when he came home from the hospital that as long as he was in the living room, lying on his back in an iron lung, and he'd get out in the daytime, but he's still in the living room and didn't go very many places. As long as he was in the house, she was stuck there too. And she wanted more for herself. So in the book, there's a feminist story undercurrent, which was she was seeking her own liberation. She wanted to be more than a housewife. She wanted to get a college education. I'll tell you later on, she actually went to Cal herself and graduated. She wanted to be educated. She wanted to travel. She wanted to work. She ended up getting a master's degree, becoming a counselor. She wanted a bigger life outside the house, but she had to get him out. So the two of them had to get themselves out of the family living room and out into the world and do something bigger.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more too about, you mentioned the administrators who wouldn't let Ed graduate because of driver's ed and PE requirements, which are obviously silly at this moment in time. To them, it might not have been, but that's the thing is I'm asking is what were the attitudes like about disability at the time? What were people thinking when they saw somebody like Ed, or when they had to approve disabled people to graduate, those types of things?
They didn't say someone like Ed. That's the key. They didn't. And so Ed, he lived across the street from the high school, and his mother made him go over there. And he did finish his requirements. But to any reasonable person, you would not expect anything of Ed's life. They weren't just saying he was going to do driver's ed. They were saying, how is this going to matter? What are you going to do? What's this high school? The administrators thought that his mother's head was in the sky, that she was dreaming of unicorns. This is silliness. Don't, why are you even doing this? There's no future for a person like that.
but he had a huge future. I mean, he moved to Cal, and that just opened up a whole new world for him. I mean, he, had all the folks that were also disabled come and kind of gathered. It was, if you are in a movie, if you're writing a movie about this, this is the scene where they, go out and collect all the friends that are going to help you later on, right?
Right, right. You collect him. There's a scene where they're all hanging out. They're smoking pot. They're listening to the Grateful Dead, and they're all realizing that before they came together, each of them thought that their predicament was individual, that it was because of them that their life was limited. And this helped them to depersonalize and de-individualize, to realize, well, wait a minute, the obstacles you're bumping into are the same obstacles I'm bumping into, and it's about the world out there. They're not even letting me do what I can do. So it really was, like a radical. I mean, Ed was a political science major and, did an education all the way through his PhD. He didn't write his dissertation. But so he was highly educated in politics. But there was no better place to learn radical politics than Berkeley in the late 60s. They were schooled every day about how to become a movement.
And they did. And then they went and they got curb cuts. They went to Berkeley City Hall. They got them in buildings. They fought for things that they knew were important like that. And from a transportation standpoint, they got their electric wheelchairs, which is a mobility thing. The discussion we have a lot of the times on the podcast is about access, right? And accessibility. And they were opening up people's eyes about what accessibility actually meant.
Yeah, and you're right. The beginning, and this is something most of us don't think too much about. We probably see someone out in public using a wheelchair, and we don't think too often about the technology of the chair. Occasionally, you see someone getting sort of pushed on an old-fashioned wheelchair with somebody pushing them on the handles behind them. But more often, we see a pretty high-tech device with an electric motor. What that did, and this is a mid-60s invention, the initial ones actually were just this funny little motor unit that you stuck onto the back of the typical old wheelchair and just souped up a regular wheelchair. And they were pretty dangerous. But it allowed young people like Ed and his friends to go out on campus without a chaperone, without a wheelchair pusher. There's an incredible lack of privacy by always having somebody take care of your physical mobility. And when you could suddenly be the person who says, yes, I'll go get the beer. Yes, I'm coming across campus to this party. They were thrilled. I compare it in the book to sort of early 1900s, maybe 1920s, with the automobile. And where suddenly there's a privacy for young people to get in the automobile, the family automobile, and to get away from the house and to get out on the road. And suddenly now you have your own way of getting around, you have your own mobility, but you have a privacy and an independence, a freedom. And it's not exactly the same. You can't go as far in a wheelchair as you can in an automobile, but it was an independence and a freedom, a tremendous technological step forward.
But to use it, you had to have curb cuts. You had to have access from the built environment. And, people at the time, they didn't see people with wheelchairs, so they didn't think that there was a problem. They were invisible. And so the problem was invisible. Obviously, we know now today that, and as a parent now, I know that curb cuts are hugely important for strollers and getting all over the place. But that lack of visibility really didn't help, and they had to make themselves visible in order to get these changes enacted.
Right. And they were lucky. There was a development that they took advantage of. The People's Park basically protest, thousands of people, essentially a riot that was very violent. Ended up with lots of injuries and involvement of the military in 1969. And that left a lot of the downtown Berkeley area as just a mess. And so the Berkeley City Council, very thoughtfully said, we're not just going to clean up, we're going to redo all the sidewalks. We're going to make it all new and spiffy and take a step forward here. And Ed and his friends, including John Hessler, Hale Zukas, Hale became the real leader when it came to all physical access and transportation and mobility issues. They went to the city council and said, hey, we want to get around in Berkeley. Can you do this? They called them ramps in those days. They didn't call them curb cuts, but can you do this, on the new sidewalks? Give us some slants on the corners. They even had designs They had worked up designs for this, and the city council thought it was a very reasonable request. They had no idea this request was coming. Like you said, to the non-disabled person, I mean, even to this day, I was in Berkeley a lot doing the research. And I was in the hotel one day and a man asked me, "Hey, you're visiting. What are you doing in Berkeley?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh, I own a store, a tuxedo shop, and that Americans with Disability Act, I just can't stand that. I don't get any disabled people." He's telling me now, I don't get disabled people in my store. Why should it be accessible? And I'm like, oh God, that attitude is still there, especially considering that most kinds of physical access are pretty cheap. Most of them. I'm not going to say all of them, but most of them are not all that expensive. So that attitude was that, well, we don't see people like you out in public. We just assumed you didn't want to go in public. And saying, didn't want to go. No, we all wanted to stay in our parents' back bedroom. Of course, that's what they wanted. So Ed and his crew, they came out, they made their voices heard, and in 1969, they created curb cuts in Berkeley in the downtown area. Quickly, they launched a project to try to do the same in Oakland. Oakland's right next door, and then they had some leverage. But really, if you go back, I mean, everyone likes to say Berkeley was the beginning. From what I can tell, the first curb cuts were over a decade earlier in Kalamazoo, in Michigan. And again, this was what happens is somebody has a need and they approach leaders, and when the leaders are open to it and reasonable, they listen. In Kalamazoo, it was a lawyer who had a physical disability, and he came to the city manager and said, "Can you, create some ramps in the downtown area so I can get around?" And the city manager just so happened to have a son who used a wheelchair. And so sometimes you get that little bit of serendipity. And so they made the downtown, the sidewalks accessible. But as you realize, that creates a whole new problem. Now people want to go somewhere. Now they can get on the sidewalks. It doesn't mean you can get into the store. It doesn't mean you can get into the restaurant. It doesn't mean you can get into the restroom. It doesn't mean you can get on the BART, line. You can get two things, but now there's more access issues.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask you about ADA in a second, but we also had, we had Sarah Hendren on in 2020 to talk about her book. And I don't know if you read this book, What a Body Can Do. It's episode 308 for folks who want to listen back to that one. But she talked about Ed as well and shared ideas about designing for independent living, which I want to ask you about next. But I think it's really interesting, the idea that for disabled people, there's always this whiz bang want to make of technology, like a wheelchair that can go upstairs or things like that. And it's actually, if you can make it so that people can live independently and you can do these designs like curb cuts, it might make it better for everybody, universal design and those types of things. So I'm fascinated by that too, is this idea that, we sometimes maybe think about technology as something that can save everybody from something, but it might not be something that's necessary if we can figure out a way to do the easier things first.
And we also have grand heroic notions of technology. So as you just pointed out, we love to see, that wheelchair that can climb the steps.
Yeah.
Or if you've ever seen the I don't even know the word for it. There's this armature that you can put on.
Like an exoskeleton, right?
Yes, that's it. Yeah. Exoskeleton for a person with a physical disability. Oh, let's get everyone a $25,000. I don't know what it costs.
Yeah, right. I'm sure it's something like that.
$25,000 exoskeleton, And, okay, that's great in some kind of futuristic movie, but in real life, what happens is, and I swear, here I'm supposed to be the guy who knows something. I'm having, coffee in my office with a student who uses a wheelchair, and I say, hey, actually, I wasn't having coffee. We were talking, and I said, hey, let's get coffee. Let's go across the street to my favorite coffee shop. So we go across the street. I didn't even realize into the coffee shop was about an 1.5 inch step up. It was the smallest bump up. And I never noticed. Why did I never notice? I'm not the guy in the wheelchair. I didn't. So I'm embarrassed. I brought my friend and he can't even get in. And then, of course, the next week I go back to my coffee shop by myself. And when I went to the restroom, here's the shop that you can't even get in the front door with the wheelchair, but the restroom has every access feature available. We often are just so foolish. So it's not about getting the exoskeleton. Sometimes it's just about some really simple common sense kinds of steps that make things better.
This is also a story about pushing past perceived boundaries and perceived limits, understanding that there's a bigger pie out there if you make it bigger. There's not a zero sum game. And so I feel like this is something that the book teaches as well.
Yeah, there was an idea. One of the difficulties that Ed and his friends, as they attempted to bring the disability, well, what I'm now calling the disability community, using the singular, attempted to bring them together in the 70s was to realize that it wasn't one community. Often it was broken up into many organizations based on disability. There was a group for the blind, a group for the deaf, a group for paralyzed veterans. There were all these subgroups that all battle at the state level, at the federal level for a very small pot of money. And when you first went to these groups and said, let's come together to fight for some common goals, they all thought, no, we're going to lose our part of the pie. Yeah, I know it's too small, but we don't want to lose our little piece by joining up with you. And so one of the advances they made, one of the great discoveries they made was that people with different kinds of disabilities and from different walks of life and different racial groups could come together under one banner, that they could make some progress that wasn't possible if the organizations for the blind were fighting over here and the organizations for people with developmental disabilities were fighting over there. So unity was a new idea, and they assumed that they could expand opportunities and federal funding. And they found that that was true. Now, I'll tell you today that funding for virtually every kind of support program at the federal level is much too low, but they still found possibilities for expansion and for making progress.
Their thinking also brought this new thinking on independent living. And I want to read this quote from the book because I feel like it captures it really, really well. And it says, this shifted the focus from what a person could do by themselves to what they could achieve with suitable assistance. Tying one's own shoes or buttoning up one's own shirt wasn't the best use of time and energy for a disabled person who, if supported by a personal attendant, could successfully complete a college education or program computers for IBM.
Right. And this was the term independent living, which now we use often. So right in Berkeley, we have the Center for Independent Living. There's over 400 of these local operations around the country where disabled folks can go and receive support from other disabled people. The notion of independent living originally in the rehabilitation profession meant helping people learn to do more. And so I'll give you an example. After World War II, there was a program at the University of Illinois, and a program that benefited many, many people with physical disabilities because it brought folks with physical disabilities onto campus to go to college. And that was a big breakthrough. But that program required that you had to be able to take care of your own physical needs. You had to be able to bathe yourself. You had to be able to get out of your bed, into your clothes, into the shower. You had to be able to feed yourself, tie your shoes, etc. And that left a lot of people out. But Ed and his friends realized that with just, a small amount of assistance from an attendant, someone who can't tie their shoes, who Ed spent his entire life. Here's this man I wrote this book about who changed the world and traveled the world, making incredible leaps. Every day, the food entered his mouth because someone else scooped it in. Every day. So as long as he had support and assistance on some of these daily care tasks, and not just true for him, true for many, many people, the sky was the limit what he could do. Get an education, jobs, recreation, relationships, etc. But no, he was not going to feed himself. And so if you require someone to leap over a threshold, which is, well, once you can feed yourself and clothe yourself, now we're going to take you seriously, that cuts out a lot of people and a lot of really talented people.
Yeah, you can become the head of a state agency, right?
Yes, you could run when he ran the Department of Rehabilitation, the largest state disability related agency in the country. run by a man who at one point was turned down by that agency because the agency called him, and I quote, infeasible. When Ed first applied for funding from the California Department of Rehabilitation, they turned him down. They rejected him because he wasn't worth their money. And what was that, 1962? And so by 1975, under the first Governor Jerry Brown administration, 13 years later, he's running that organization. So if you put the right pieces in place, many things can happen.
How much did the myth of Ed Roberts feed into an eventual destiny? You mentioned earlier, and you mentioned in the book too, how, FDR was really the only person that people ever saw in a wheelchair before that. But he wasn't really, he wasn't really that open about it necessarily to the wider world. But Ed became someone who people looked up to, someone who they said, oh, well, we could be like Ed, or Ed can help us, or those types of things. Did that feed into his ego at all? But also how did that feed, like, the myth of it, of him being this larger than life character in the world, lead into something that actually came to pass in the end?
I think I can relate it to other famous. I mean, he was famous within certain circles, but I can relate it to other famous people and the mythologies that surround them. I think of athletes and the stories that you hear about athletes. I love one of my favorite, the Boston Celtics. So Larry Bird, there used to be a story that he wouldn't just make the great shot at the end of the game. He would tell the man defending him, this is what I'm going to do. There was a whole mythology around him that added to his aura and his power and his presence. And it was the same for Ed. Ed became known around the world as this, the hope of the disability community. And yes, he used that to his benefit. He used it to the benefit of the movement. But also, yes, it went to his head. He promised things he couldn't deliver. There were times when he was much too big for himself. There's two sides to that knife. It really helped him, and there's times that he believed his own press clippings a little bit too much.
He wasn't the only one. There was many folks around the country that were advocates in this way, and there's actually a kind of a not a West Coast, East Coast, but like a Texas versus a Berkeley factions, as it were. I actually saw Lex Frieden, who was in the Texas faction, speak in October. And he had like this virtual avatar that he had created and was able to project onto the screen from his home in Texas to Portland, Oregon. But I'm interested in this Berkeley versus Houston kind of model and the discussions about the segregation of disabled people for service purposes, as well as those different political factions and what they felt like they could achieve based on realities that were on the ground.
Yeah. And Lex was wonderful and did a very lengthy interview with me and did really let me ask him hard questions. I think in Ed's mind, we tend to think of great civil rights leaders as just being on a pedestal and nothing gets in their way. But really, there are egos and there are internal struggles. And Ed viewed Lex Frieden, who was a Texas-based disabled man and a leader of independent living in Houston. He viewed him as sort of a rival. Now, there's many reasons to view him as a rival. For one, Lex was just very talented and very, very smart and very articulate. He could do a lot of what Ed did, but his politics were different. Houston was not Berkeley. The Houston politics were mild. And this was, frankly, you have to realize, was true for most of the country. There's not many places like Berkeley or even San Francisco. The politics are different in Omaha. So for Lex Frieden, what happened was people with physical disabilities in Houston, he helped them to create a number of sort of apartment complexes or sections, portions of apartment complex where they would get every single apartment. And then they could share attendance. Because the problem they had in Texas was there really was no way to recruit personal attendants, to pay for them. It was just a real big difficulty. And so to live close together was the model, that they came up with. And it worked for them. But yes, it was very segregated. It was the opposite of what the Berkeley crew wanted. Ed and his cohort in Berkeley had decided long ago segregation is the anathema. That is the enemy. We do not want to be segregated. But they also had, to their benefit from the 1950s, There's been funding in California to help pay for in-home support for people with disabilities. And so while it was a challenge to recruit and train and find good personal attendants, that was a challenge that the folks in Berkeley took on, but there was funding. In Berkeley, they had that. In Houston, they didn't. So they end up with very different approaches, and they kind of bump head to head. The interesting thing is you jump ahead in the story, and you mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act, and realized that that was put forward and carried, the football was carried over the line in the late 80s by Texas Republicans. The Bush administration and Texas conservatives were the ones who actually passed. They did it in a bipartisan way with the Democrats being involved, but it was not Berkeley radicalism that made the ADA happen. That was not Ed's stage.
I was wondering about that because I was reading the book and I noticed that Ed was a little bit absent from those 1990 ADA. He wasn't absent from the discussions necessarily, but he wasn't like leading. His face wasn't the front of it. It was Lex and Dart, right?
Yeah, and Justin Dart, who was another disabled man from Texas from a very, very wealthy family. Now, we have to realize Justin Dart, who had, I go in one chapter, he had really a very, very difficult life of depression and addiction. And when he finally kind of rose from the ashes and decided, I'm going to do something good, he rushed off to Berkeley to learn from Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts how to be an activist in this disability rights movement that was already underway. But he was well positioned. He had a family that had an in with Ronald Reagan and the Bushes, and so he had a political access. So he took what they taught him, and he became the figurehead. He became, in a different story, it would have been Ed Roberts in a different movie. But in this actual what happened, it ended up being the Republicans leading the way, and they needed a Texas Republican, not a far left-wing Berkeley long hair. So he was in the background by then, yes.
I think it's funny. I was born in Humble, Texas, and I grew up in Houston, but my family is from San Francisco in the Bay Area. I had 5 family members go to Cal. My dad and my aunt and my uncle were there in that time period. And so it's really interesting to see the two because I've lived in both of them at the same time. And so I just find that really fascinating. And I'm glad that it all came to pass. Ed and his colleagues really did create a masterclass in organizing, though. This organizing, the amount of press that they could generate. But how do you find money for all these projects? I find that interesting, too, because there's money from the state for all of the attendance and the healthcare related things. But what about the money for the organizing and for putting everything together?
So their hub, their vehicle for getting the word out and for pushing things forward was the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, which is still alive today. And Ed was a tremendous fundraiser. He had a sidekick named Joan Leon. Joan still lives in Berkeley. I saw her just a few weeks ago. And Joan had a background in fundraising, and she wandered into Ed's life when he most needed it. And Ed knew how to go into the offices of wealthy, big foundations, and he knew how to get money from them. He just was very powerful. He was very persuasive. He came in to the Center for Independent Living, and within 18 months, he increased the revenue from, under 50,000 to well over $1 million. And that's in $1970. I mean, he knew how to raise money. He knew how to pull heartstrings. And this was one of his great gifts, was convincing people to bet on him. And he really did this his entire life. Now, later, he won the MacArthur, if you've heard of the MacArthur Genius Grant or the MacArthur Foundation, he won that, which was a large sum of money each year for 5 years. So that really helped. But he also was good at working with politicians. In California, he worked with the legislature to get passed a bill that would fund independent living centers across the entire state. And later, they were able to get a very, very similar sort of bill that would start the independent living centers around the entire country, paid for with tax dollars. Realize I'm talking about Ed, but he didn't do these things alone. I mean, he was always surrounded by a team. I mentioned Judy Heumann. She was an East Coast activist from New York City, and he called her on the phone one day. She didn't even know who he was. And he basically said, you got to come out here. He was recruiting for his team. He was the coach trying to bring in the star quarterback. And they worked together really for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it definitely is a story of a group of folks, especially during a lot of the activism too. You have the fight for Section 504. You got the funding for the centers. You just mentioned that, but the impressive part of that was during the Prop 13, right? Which is
Right, right.
when, obviously here in California, as you know, it's Prop 13 is still a very well-known entity. And there was a lot of pressure to cut when that passed, and they got, that funding through, which is, I was reading the book and I was just like, that's amazing, because everybody knows Prop 13, that's the third rail.
It was amazing when Prop 13 went through. For those who don't know much about it, it put a limit on how much taxes on homes and properties could go up each year, which really limited the state government spending. It really caused them to do some dramatic sudden cuts. And so the governor, Jerry Brown, told both branches of the legislature, any bills you have that call for spending, forget it. Just drop them right now. And they went forward anyway. And I won't tell that whole story. I want you to
Go read the book.
I want you to go read. Go read. There's a heartbreaking Hollywood kind of chapter in there where they actually win and they actually get it through, and Governor Brown signs it. But it's a little bit of a Hollywood kind of story.
But the details are great. Go get the book, and I'll plug that in a second. Also, from a transportation standpoint, an urban planning standpoint, which is a lot of what we talk about on the show, I'm curious how Ed got around. At the end, the only reference I heard, and obviously his wheelchair, but the only reference I read in the book was he had a van at the end. And so I'm wondering, if you knew more about how he got around, how he accessed, did he use BART to get places? What was the access like for him to get around the Bay Area, to get to the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley and all those types of places?
Yeah, I know that making BART accessible in both the trains themselves, but also the stations, which often the difficulty was the stations themselves.
The elevators,
in terms of elevators and all the different levels. And that was a big push for Hale Zukas. But much of the time, I know Ed got around in an accessible van at the state. He worked 8 years for state government, so he had an accessible van there. In fact, not only that, but he outfitted his home with the latest high-tech doodads. He loved technology, and he had access. He was someone who would just call people up, in offices in Stanford and Cal and say, hey, can you do this? Can you do that? And people loved the challenge. So he often had, even his wheelchair was very souped up. I mean, this thing could spin tires, and, and had lights all over it. He loved the technology. He flew a lot.
Mm-hmm.
This was flying. He died in 1995. So this is flying before our current sort of TSA and all the steps that we take. So actually, he would send his attendant down on the tarmac to help the workers load up the wheelchair underneath the belly of the plane, because you could even look up afterwards what percentage of power wheelchairs get broken flying on airplanes, and it's pretty outrageous.
Yeah.
They get broken frequently. And then he would, get loaded on the plane, but often you mentioned it before, the magic was, they call it frog breathing, which was he taught himself how to swallow air. And he could do it over long flights, but he flew around the world. So he did fly a lot.
His wheelchair is at the Smithsonian too now.
Yeah, it is. And there's a chapter in there about that. Just because something's at the Smithsonian doesn't mean it's in a...
Well, it's like you said, it's like the Indiana Jones end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
It's in a dark, dusty corner in a very large room. Many things are stored.
But the story of how it got there, I think, is more important than it is there, I think.
The story is a beautiful story about how it got there.
Yeah. What did you take away from writing this book?
Oh, one thing, and this might not be what you think of, but I spent 8 years, day to day to day, with a man who had already passed away. I never met him. And yet, for me to research about him, this is in archives with many, many interviews. I spent my days with him. And so I know this sounds weird. He became my friend. He became a friend and someone for me to learn from about living. At one point, in an interview, his colleague, I had mentioned Joan Leon, who worked side by side with him for decades. And I asked her at one point, why why did you want to work with Ed? And she said, well, from early on, I thought he maybe had like the secret of life. And I kind of stood up because I'll tell you, I've conducted a lot of interviews and people don't say things like that. They just don't say quotable stuff like that. They say a lot of the secret of life. And I thought, wait a minute, without getting too spiritual, without getting out of, it's supernatural. He knew something. He knew something about living. And it's because of how he was reduced to a body that only did certain things. And he was challenged with that and he accepted it. And then he tried to live big. And so I've taken a lot of lessons. I'm not him. I'm not him. I don't live that way. It takes all my gusto just to do an interview like this. Never mind go travel the world and shake the hands of world leaders. I'm not him, but I think I've learned a lot about living from Ed.
Is there something that people don't talk about or don't ask you about the book that you feel like is important?
It's right now I'm doing, interviews like this and doing events and stuff. And there's a tendency, the disability community and the activist community kind of comes out and they use the events as sort of a celebration often, which is great. That is wonderful. But the book is not just a book about a hero. It's about a real man who makes mistakes and has flaws and doesn't do everything right. So I think the book is about a real person. And so, yes, we've been speaking, and I get excited about Ed. It's hard for me not to. I feel sometimes like, yes, I'm talking about Babe Ruth, but, I'm talking about a guy who had problems and difficulties and did things wrong and insulted people when he didn't want to or left people out by mistake. And that's in the book. I tried to write about him as a real person.
Yeah, I did notice that. There's a lot of, being honest about certain things. The relationship with people of color, the relationship with women and even people in his life. Those are a number of things that pop up in the book. But definitely go read it. The book's called An Independent Man, Ed Roberts and the Fight for Disability Rights by Scot Danforth. Where can folks get a copy?
Well, you first say go to your independent bookstore.
That's right.
That's your first stop. You can go to the University of California Press. Go to their website. You can order directly from them. And if you want to go to the big box places, yes, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all those websites, they carry it too.
Where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
If I wish to be found.
I always ask.
You can find me on the web at Chapman University. My email is danforth@chapman.edu.
Cool. Well, Scott, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, we're past the main credits. Here we are at the end of the show. But I do want to give a shout out to some of our $10 a month or more Patreon supporters who've been helping the show along with your very, very generous support. If you've made it this far, you're probably a really big listener and reader. We really appreciate that. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. First names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabrielle, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Ed, Matthew, and recently added Sylvia. Everybody who listens to this show and reads the newsletter is much, much appreciated. I just wanted to give our biggest supporters a little extra love and recognition. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.